instruments to accelerate it, to solidify its form. I remember being taught all this in graduate school at Columbia University in the 1950s. Professor John Fairweather praised corporations to the sky as the one instrument that could ensure peace and stability. And out of all this emerged eventually the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, then later the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, NAFTA, and now the coup de grace, the World Trade Organization. The first global organization with truly draconian ruling powers. Modern globalization has a primary purpose: to rapidly transfer real global economic and, in the end, political power to corporations, away from nation states, which have the habit of making troublesome restrictions and regulations, and have health standards and environmental rules and labor laws and consumer laws, and they can only slow down the freedom of corporations to go where they want, do what they want, jam into new countries, exploit the last resources, drive out local businesses, bargain down global wage levels, convert everything to exports, commodify every last element of the commons, water, culture, the genetic structures of life. Modern globalization enshrines and encodes the unrestricted, mobile, free corporation. Something, by the way, that free trade gurus like Adam Smith and David Ricardo would have abhorred. They believe local capital should stay local. The global economy tries to integrate and unify all economic activity on the planet within one single centralized super system. Countries with cultures and traditions as different as India, Brazil, Portugal, Costa Rica, Sweden, China, are all meant to merge their activities within a single conceptual framework and process, which is economic, but also cultural and political. The net result is what some of our colleagues, notably Helena Norberg Hodge, have labeled monoculture. One global homogenized culture, one global market, one economic political structure controlled by a few corporations and the bureaucracies they've created. And that's where the WTO comes in. That's the agency that can make it all possible. An all-powerful superstructure that all nations must follow and that speeds the way for corporate freedoms. In the end, corporations are gaining freedom, nation-states and citizens are losing freedom. Now, I'm aware that there are some in this room who probably may have reservations also about the power of nation-states, which haven't behaved all that well either. And don't mind if these powers are diminished, but please remember what's replacing them. New global bureaucracies effectively run by corporations in their own interests who do not even presume to act in behalf of human beings or nature. As David Corden and others have put it, we are entering the era of corporate rule. The WTO was only created 5 years ago, but it's been given spectacular powers, ceded to it by nation-states, powers that used to reside within nations, powers to actually rule over constitutional sovereign democracies, and powers to enforce their decisions. Powers way beyond any ever given before to any other international body, including the United Nations. In only 5 years' time, the WTO has come to rival the International Monetary Fund as the most powerful, secretive, and anti-democratic bodies on earth. And now it threatens to become the world's first bona fide, if unelected, global government. Its previous Director General, Renato Ruggiero, put it bluntly: we are trying to create the new global constitution for a global economy. Okay, why didn't Bill Clinton tell us that? So we could have voted him out of office right away. Right here in Seattle, the WTO will actually try to expand its already huge powers through a new millennium round of negotiations, as you'll hear from others on the stage in a couple of minutes. And that's why people are upset. Of course, the WTO's most notable powers concern its ability to enter into the internal political processes of nation-states, to challenge member nations' constitutional rights to make laws and standards, if these are seen as obstacles to corporate free trade, as the WTO defines it and as in its own all-powerful secret tribunals rule. In practice, these obstacles are the everyday laws of communities and nations. Laws about environment, labor, health, consumers, small business, community values, and democracy.
Any of these could be found inconvenient for corporate free trade, which must always be the primary standard. And only rarely, in all its 5 years, the WTO has never once ruled in favor of the environment, and only rarely in favor of a third world country. I'm sure Lori Wallach may give us further details in a little while. You can think of the WTO as a kind of global deregulation authority, and it's absolutely appalling that sovereign governments have so enthusiastically signed constitutional rights over to such a corporate bureaucracy. This is no natural process. It's a system created by people in power who gather in secret meetings, you can call it conspiratorial, to create rules that benefit them and enforcement mechanisms to go with them. It's not a natural system, it's a design system. An experiment, actually, but one that only benefits corporations while destroying community, democracy, livelihoods, and nature. And finally, I want to go into just the ultimate rationale for free trade and globalization theories, which was that freeing up corporations would bring vastly accelerated economic growth, benefiting all people. The homily is this: a rising tide will lift all boats. But does it? All recent research shows that only a small number of people at the top of the corporate pyramid, CEOs of global corporations and a small number in upper management, experience significant benefits from all the growth, expansion, mergers, and consolidation that goes with this model. Meanwhile, gaps between rich and poor, within countries and between countries, have never been greater than now. Even in the US, where we're in an extended period of so-called prosperity, the figures are not so great. While corporate profits are higher than they've ever been, and CEO salaries are often in the tens of millions or hundreds of millions, and in one case 500 million, real wages of ordinary workers are falling, good jobs are being replaced by part-time and temporary work in the service sectors. You may have seen the cartoon of two men talking. One remarks that Clinton is celebrating that there are more jobs now in the US than ever before. And the other answers, I know, I have 3 of them. American CEOs are now paid on average, according to the Institute for Policy Studies, 419 times more than line workers. Median hourly wages in the US, when adjusted for inflation, are down by 10% in the last 25 years. The US Federal Reserve reports that the top 20% of the US population owns 84% of all the wealth in the country. And the wealth of the world's 475 billionaires is equal to the annual incomes of more than 50% of the people on Earth. What's going on? Of the 100 largest companies in the world, of the 100 largest economies in the world, 52 are corporations. Only 48 are countries. As for jobs, from all this consolidation, the top 200 global corporations now account for about 30% of global economic activity, but employ 1/2% of the global workforce. Lifting all boats, indeed. Apparently, we only lift yachts. Meanwhile, according to a UN study, the gap between rich nations and poor ones is also expanded because of inequities in the global trading system. To third worlders, it's already clear to see that they already clearly see that the present rules of globalization are meant to benefit not them, but only stateless corporations. But once we'll grasp this and demand recovery of our powers, everything will change, just as Ralph Nader has suggested. We can start right here, right now. No expansion of the WTO. No new powers. No millennium round. Reassessment of the entire WTO project with a full plate of participants, including people in this room, and of the economic globalization free trade model too. If it can't be changed to serve democracy, nature, and human beings, if it can't alter its hierarchy of values to include equity among all nations and a fully participatory process, and many people feel that it cannot be so reformed, then we'd all be better off without it and start all over.
few, but I do want to say to Jerry Mander and Debbie Barker and Victor Minotti and all the people at the International Forum on Globalization who put this fabulous weekend together. Thank you for all of us. On behalf of all of us, a tremendous thanks to Lori Wallach and Mike Dolan and Margareta Strand and Sally Soriano and all the people who put on the incredible week that you're about to witness at Public Citizen and also the organizing committee here in Seattle. Thank you. Who has been a Trojan horse for us, a warrior, a trade warrior for us for many, many years, who brought many of us into this fight and who has single-handedly taken on the WTO in an incredible way, who spent the last 6 months in Geneva sending us out daily submissions on what was happening. Martin, you might have been lonely, but we love you. Martin Core, thank you very much. I've got 2 things on my jacket. The first is a button that says Seattle, 11/30/1999, the day the WTO stands still. Let's make it happen. And I've also got a gold ribbon on my lapel here. I spoke last night in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, to the National Farmers Union and a Canadian Farm Women's Conference, and the women asked me to take this ribbon to Seattle, to wear it all week, to give me courage and remind me what we're doing here. And they reminded me, and I will tell you, that although we have had record exports of agricultural products in the last year, we have the lowest net farm income at the farm gate since 1926, when Canada first started taking any kind of statistics on this. So something's really wrong somewhere, and I wear this very proudly on behalf of the farmers of my country. Woodrow Wilson in 1907, and I thought it might set the tone for us as we get ready for this week. Woodrow Wilson said this about trade. He said, since trade ignores national boundaries and manufacturers insist on having the world as a market, the flag of the nation must follow him, and the doors of the nations which are closed against him must be battered down. Concessions obtained by financiers must be safeguarded by ministers of state, even if the sovereignty of an unwilling nation be outraged in the process. Colonies must be obtained or planted in order that no useful corner of the world may be overlooked or left unused. Well, he sure got his dream, didn't he? Well, here we are, we're on the eve of the millennium. We're gathered to confront the largest concentration of corporate power ever assembled. Trade ministers and the negotiators of 135 countries are going to be greeted by the WTO host committee, co-chaired by Bill Gates of Microsoft and Phil Condit of Boeing Corporation. These folks I know indeed, my dears, they promise their corporate friends that for a certain amount of money, and the more you pay, the higher access you get, you can speak directly to the politicians and the trade negotiators. Needless to say, there's no such official welcoming host committee made up of environmentalists and justice advocates and union activists, although I dare say we're going to give them the odd unofficial welcome this week. The WTO has become the most powerful institution in the world, and I think we need to remember why we are here and why it is so dangerous, because it now touches every part of our lives. What makes the WTO so powerful and so dangerous is it has both the legislative and judicial power to challenge the laws, policies, and programs of countries that do not conform to the lowest common denominator rules set by the WTO, and to strike them down if they're seen as being hostile to unregulated trade. In fact, as we know, the WTO has become the most powerful tool of transnational capital, and these corporations work hand in hand with trade bureaucrats in Geneva and Washington and Ottawa and everywhere that they exist to establish what is in essence a system of global corporate governance. Now, at the heart of the WTO is an assault on everything left standing in the commons, in the public realm. Everything is now for sale. Even those areas of life that we once considered sacred, like health and education, food and water and air and seeds and gene and heritage. It is all now for sale. Economic freedom, not democracy, and not ecological stewardship is the defining metaphor of the WTO. And its central goal is humanity's mastery of the natural world through its total commodification. Now, I want to take my few minutes here tonight to sound the alarm about one aspect of this. You're going to hear so many different areas of concern around the WTO, but I want to talk about the potential impact of the WTO on the very source of life, which is water. The destruction of aquatic ecosystem health and the increasing water scarcity are, in my opinion, the most pressing environmental problems facing humankind. The first myth to counter is that there's a lot of water to go around. We're treating it badly, but there's lots of water. This is not true. The amount of fresh water available in the world is only 1/2 of 1% of the total world's water stock. And every year that needs to stretch to welcome 85 million new people into the world. Yet we are depleting, diverting, and polluting that finite supply at an astonishing rate. Today, 31 countries are facing water stress and scarcity, and over 1 billion people lack access to clean drinking water. We know that 5 million people, most of them children, die every year from illnesses caused by poor drinking water. If we do not change our ways, by the year 2025, as much as 2/3 of the world will be living in either water scarcity or total water deprivation. This is the major environmental crisis of our time. Groundwater overpumping and aquifer depletion are now an urgent problem in the world's most intensive agriculture areas, and water is being depleted many, many times faster than nature can replenish it. This means that instead of living on water income, we are now living on water capital, and we are facing water bankruptcy. The global expansion in mining and manufacturing is increasing the threat of pollution, and these underground water supplies are contaminating aquifers all over the world. 90% of most of the world's communities still dump their raw sewage directly into the waterways of the world. At the same time, overexploitation of the planet's major river systems is threatening another finite source of water. From the Nile in Egypt to the Ganges in South Asia to the Yellow River in China and the Colorado in America, these are just some of the major rivers that no longer reach the sea. And of course, we've diverted and overtapped and dammed our waterways to the point that they no longer exist in their natural forms. All through Latin America, China, and Asia, massive industrialization is affecting the balance between humans and nature in rural communities. Agribusiness growing crops for export is claiming more and more of the water once used by family and peasant farmers for food self-sufficiency, and industry is creeping up the major river systems, drinking them dry as they go. Already, as big industrial wells probe the water, millions of Chinese farmers have found their wells pumped dry, and 80% of China's major rivers are so degraded they no longer support fish. Similarly, 75% of Russia's lake and river water is unsafe to drink. There is simply no way to overstate the danger of this water crisis to the planet today. The World Bank and many others have said that the wars of the next century will be about water. I want to say that no piecemeal solution is going to prevent the collapse of whole societies and ecosystems, and that a radical rethinking of our values, priorities, and political systems is urgent. And yet, just as humanity is beginning to face this stark crisis, political leaders of just about every stripe have embraced the ideology of economic globalization, and they're integrating their national and local economies into a single, deregulated global market, thereby freeing transnational capital from the constraints of domestic law. All over the world, governments are dismantling environmental legislation or allowing industry to police itself, essentially commodifying nature. In fact, forces are already at work that would see water become a private commodity to be sold and traded on the open market, controlled by transnational corporations, and guaranteed to the private use of capital through global trade and investment agreements of the WTO. in industries ranging from municipal water and wastewater services to an explosion in bottled water to the mass bulk water removals by tanker, corporations are lining up to exploit the increasingly desperate global demand for water. Water is the last infrastructure frontier for private investors, says the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development president. The world of privatized water is overwhelmingly dominated by two transnationals from France, Vivendi and Suez Lyonnaise des Eaux, the General Motors and Ford company of the water world. They are joined by mega energy industries like Enron, that has just set up a water division headed by the dreaded Rebecca Mark, who swears she will not rest until the entire world's water is privatized. And then, of course, there are global shipping companies eager to begin the global trade in commercial bulk water. Now, governments and international government agencies are paving the way for the commodification of water. The UN Economic and Social Council Commission on Sustainable Development actually proposes that governments turn to large multinational corporations for capital and expertise and calls for an open market in water rights. At a recent UN conference in Paris, governments proposed to turn water into a global commodity driven by market forces and higher prices, and they called for an enlarged role for the private sector. Now, in this, they have a good friend in the World Trade Organization, because high on the list for negotiations this week in Seattle are services, and high on the list within the services sector is an item called environmental services, which includes water. If environmental services are put on the table, every member country of the WTO will have to open its municipal water services, and in fact, the governance of all its natural resources to global private competition. And the transnational corporations will have the right to bid for public funding in these areas. By the way, the Safe Service Agreement is talking about opening up health, education, and social programs as well. Further, both the WTO and the North American Free Trade Agreement have adopted the GATT definition of a good, which includes water. Now, this is very important because Article 11 of the GATT specifically prohibits the use of export controls for any purposes and eliminates quantitative restrictions on imports and exports. The WTO and NAFTA both ensure what's called national treatment to transnational corporations, which means they basically can help themselves to a country's water the moment it issues its first permit. Now, the GATT does have a provision called Article 20, which purportedly allows countries to use certain measures to protect natural resources, but the use of Article 20 can be challenged as a disguised barrier to trade, and every time any country has tried to protect an environmental or health law using Article 20 against a WTO challenge, the WTO has won. In any case, the few measures allowed by Article 20 are not permitted under NAFTA, which gives them additional rights to North American corporations to sue for financial compensation if these rights are denied to them. Already we have a huge case in Canada. Sunbelt Water of Santa Barbara, California, is suing the Canadian government for $10.5 billion in damages because the company lost a contract to export bulk water when the government of British Columbia banned its export in 1993. The corporation rightly says that NAFTA gives it the right to involve itself in Canadian government policy, and I quote the president, Jack Lindsay, who says, because of NAFTA, we are now stakeholders in the national water policy of Canada. But Americans have equal cause for concern. Alaska has become the first jurisdiction in the world to pass legislation permitting the export of bulk fresh water for commercial purposes. A British Columbia company called Global Water Corp has signed a contract with Sitka, Alaska to export 18 billion gallons of glacier water per year and ship it by tanker to be bottled in one of China's infamous free trade zones. The company boasts on its website that the deterioration of the world's water quality is a great investment opportunity, and I quote, water has moved from being an endless commodity that may be taken for granted to a rational necessity that may be taken by force. Now, if Alaska were to change its mind, under the international trade rules as they exist, Global Water Corp could sue the U.S. government for all lost profit, present and future. And yet, when several governors around the Great Lakes asked Mr. Clinton this past week if he would allow the water issue to be raised at these talks this week, he said no. Now this must not be allowed to happen. Water must be exempted from both NAFTA and the World Trade Organization. As I might add, so must the trade in genes, seeds, air, health, education, social services, those of us living in water-rich areas of the world don't have a responsibility to those living in areas of water deprivation, particularly since we have to recognize that it's the corporations of the first world that have done such damage in the third. But there is a world of difference between water sharing and water trading. You can be sure that under the WTO it would not be the world's poor who would gain access to water. Rather, countries, water-intensive corporations, free trade zones, and wealthy communities able to pay top dollar would win that prize. Now, this is just the first step to prevent the commodification of the world's water. In Canada, we formed a coalition of civil society groups called Water Watch. We're developing what we call a water ethic based on the principle that water belongs to the earth and all species, is a vital part of the earth's heritage, and is a fundamental human right. Water must be preserved in the public domain for all time and protected by strong local, national, and international law. At stake is the whole notion of the commons, the idea that through our public institutions, we recognize a shared human and natural heritage to be preserved for future generations. We believe that citizens in communities around the world must be the keepers of our waterways and must establish community organizations to oversee the wise and conserving use of this precious resource. And I quote to you a lovely way of describing how water is so personal to us by Michael Parfit from National Geographic. He says, watersheds come in families, nested levels of intimacy. On the grandest scale, the hydrologic web is like all humanity. Serbs, Russians, Kyokan Indians, Amish, the billion lives of the People's Republic of China. It's broadly troubled, but it's hard to know how to help. As you work upstream toward home, you're more closely related. The big river is like your nation, a little out of hand. The lake is your cousin. The creek is your sister. The pond is her child, and for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, you're married to your sink. In closing, I just want to say that it is my fervent hope that civil society, you and me, and all of us who are gathering here this week in Seattle, will adopt this water ethic and make our mark as never before in this international gathering. And just who are we coming together from all over the world here in Seattle? Well, we are the seakeepers of democracy. We are educators and frontline healthcare workers. We are First Nations people. We are anti-poverty and social justice activists. We are committed environmentalists. We are working people from every corner of the earth. We are old and young and everything in between. We represent the majority of the earth's people, and we demand to be heard in the corridors of power. We stopped the MEI in its track, and we found that we prefer winning to losing. We put these people on notice. We will be here beyond Seattle. And we are committed with our lives to building a different model and a different future for humanity, the earth, and other species. We have envisioned a moral alternative to economic globalization, and we will not rest until we see it realized. Thank you.
Well, this is the Battle of Seattle. Historical turning point as any previous battle in the history of this country or any other. And I'm not using the idea of a battle or a war as just a metaphor or an image. I think we are really at war. Of this, but everything fits. As in other wars, there's an objective. It's the control of the world's wealth. It's an objective of power. You don't need tanks and missiles necessarily to carry out a war. You can use other methods. And if you want access to all world resources, whether financial or material or natural or human, obviously you're going to have to fight for that. So here we've got an adversary, we've got an enemy, which is the whole corporate system. And the objective of that corporate system, whether financial or industrial, is to be able to go where it wants and produce what it wants, when it wants, for as long as it wants, and to make as much money, obviously, as it can, and damn the costs. The goal is profit, and anything that enhances that goal is good. Anything that goes against that goal is bad. Now, you notice that in this model, there's absolutely nothing about employment. There's nothing, obviously, about social justice, about the environment. Any of those things, those are just side effects. Of course, corporations do employ people, but that is not their purpose. Their purpose is profit, period. But transnationals have to have rules. Any system has to have rules. Even the mafia has rules. And the rules that they want are the ones that they are attempting to write, and to some degree they have been successful. I think they need three things. They need the freedom of capital movements. That is something that the IMF takes care of. The IMF imposes its law on countries in the South and now the East, and it insists that capital be free to cross their borders in all directions. This, of course, leads to financial crises, to collapse. We'll be hearing more about that in the course of this evening and tomorrow. And the IMF has been able to put those laws into effect because countries have been so indebted. That's one set of rules. They wanted freedom of investment. And that is what they were trying to get through the multilateral agreement on investment, through the MAI. And they were absolutely stunned when popular movements defeated the MAI. Stunned and mad as hell. And don't think it's not going to come back if they have anything to say about it, because it is. That's one of the things that is likely to be, in one way or another, on the agenda of the WTO. Not necessarily as a freestanding agreement on investment, but they can get what they want also through the TRIMS agreement and through the services agreement. And then they need a third set of freedoms, which is, of course, the movement of goods and services. And that's what the GATT took care of at one point, and now it's the WTO with much more forceful means of ensuring those freedoms. Everything in the world and every aspect of human activity is defined as tradable. All our activities are objects of trade. Agriculture, natural resources, life forms, services alone. It's 11 different sectors, including health and education and environment, as Norm told us, and 160 subsectors. I don't care what your job is or what industry you are in, what you're working on, I will bet you that it can be found under the rules of the WTO. Transnational corporations control, directly or indirectly, 2/3 of all world trade. It's a misnomer to speak of trade, because if you have 1/3 of all exchanges that are taking place between affiliates of the same corporation, IBM trading with IBM, Ford trading with Ford, and that's the case for one-third or more of all world trade, that can't be called trade. A further third of what is called trade takes place between the affiliates of different transnational corporations. In other words, anything that could be called national trade is a very shrinking and small part of the total. And the rules of the 18th century simply cannot be applied to this. You can't talk about comparative advantage the way Adam Smith or David Ricardo did in the 20th century. It simply doesn't apply. But they want a rule-based system, and they, of course, want to make those rules. And if you think I'm exaggerating, just let me give you the alphabet soup of the different coalitions that have been coaching all of our negotiators at the WTO and previously at the GATT. You've got the TABD, that means the Transatlantic Business Dialogue. That's industries from both sides of the Atlantic. They just had a meeting in Berlin. They called our commissioner for Europe, Pascal Lamy, to that meeting in order to give him, and I quote, detailed recommendations. You've got the U.S. Council on International Business. You've got the U.S. Council of Service of Service Industries, which is telling Mrs. Warshawski what she is to do at the negotiations. One of the things she's supposed to do is to attack the public services in Europe, particularly health, because the healthcare industry in the United States wants to get at our nationalized health systems, and particularly wants to get what they call the market of the over 65s. That's part of Mrs. Warshawski's instructions. You've got the European Roundtable of Industrialists, the ERT, 45 presidents of the most powerful firms in Europe who are they have their office in Brussels, they are coaching the negotiators all the time. You've got the European Service Leaders Group. In other words, these people are there, they are making the rules, and they are telling the negotiators what to do. I don't agree that deregulation is a legitimate word. I think that it is a false word, a trap, and that what is really going on is re-regulation. There are rules that are being written all the time, but these rules are being written of, by, and for the corporations. Now let me come to the WTO. These rules tell us that we don't need the precautionary principle. These rules tell us that we can have child labor. They tell us that the multilateral agreements on the environment don't count, and the WTO law supersedes those agreements. They tell us that genetically manipulated organisms are good for our health, that hormone beef is delicious, and that Europe can't have a foreign policy because it was giving preferential treatment to the bananas produced by the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. No, we have to import Chiquita Brand's bananas on the same terms. In other words, we have to scrap the Lomé Convention. The polluter pays principle is outlawed as well. These are the rules that are being written by these corporations. And for a long time, all of this seemed extremely technical, remote. People were not catching on to what was happening. When the GATT was transformed into the WTO in 1994, there were some sporadic protests, but people didn't understand what was happening, and even worse, our elected representatives didn't have a clue to what was happening. But now something really is happening, and suddenly this isn't working. These corporations who want a perfect world, they want a utopia for transnationals, and nothing for consumers, for labor, for health, for education, and especially for democracy, well, they're creating the opposite of a utopia. And I looked it up. It's a dystopia, D-Y-S. A dystopia is what they are actually creating. Any war requires propaganda. And part of their propaganda is to put the slogan of free trade ahead of everything else. Free always sounds good, and if you're a protectionist, anything with an ist at the end or an isn't at the end is bad news, right? A protectionist is somebody, I don't know why, because it seems okay to me to protect your family, to protect your children, to protect your country, but suddenly this is a bad thing to be. Part of the propaganda is also that the market knows best. It's all-seeing, it's all-knowing. The market is going to be able to be the most efficient allocator of all resources, whether they're human, natural, or knowledge, or industrial resources. There's absolutely no evidence that trade is linked with growth or greater welfare. No empirical evidence, but they proceed as if this were a given. But suddenly, their dream of making universal rules is breaking down. And that's because they forgot just one thing. They forgot about the people. That's why we're fighting the Battle of Seattle. If the enemy is transnational and is going for total control, then I think it's obvious that the response has also got to be transnational, and it's got to be a mix of people. We don't want totalitarianism. That's not our goal. We want international democracy. But if we're to get it, we've got to fight for each other. We've got to fight for each other. The threat is to all of us, but we can't fight against these threats individually. Yes, the farmer, the family farm, they are threatened. They are threatened by mass exports and by cheap cereals. The Canadian farmers of the North now are losing their prices, as Maud said, are where they were in 1926. But if the farmer fights only for agriculture in the WTO, that won't work. Filmmakers and authors, yes, were threatened by the TRIPS agreement and the cultural provisions, but getting a cultural exception, the way the French government seems to think it's useful, that isn't going to work. Yes, the environment is gravely threatened, but ecologists won't save it by fighting only for environmental protection. And yes, the north-south gap is becoming a chasm, but we won't close it simply by demanding special and differential treatment for the South. Yes, labor rights and wages are being forced down everywhere, but unions are not going to protect working people by fighting only for...
The most important factor was the outpouring of public outrage. And someone asked him, how do you know that that was the main reason? Well, I know because when I went to all these countries and spoke to all the prime ministers, urging them to resuscitate the MEI, they said, no, my public will not take it. And so it was the public protest by all of you that really sank this MEI. It shocked them, it shocked the companies, and I'm sure it shocked all of you. And of course now we are in another big battle that probably none of us thought.
I can convince you that we are in a war. You've got to think about who your allies are also. Our government's allies. Well, I'm very sorry to say that it's a rare government that's an ally in this struggle. There's a permanent government. The pacts you got coming in say an invisible government, and that's true, but there's also a permanent government, which is the government of the industrial and financial corporations. And then every now and then we're allowed to elect men in suits, they mostly are men, who read the script. They read the script for the permanent government. And the state seems to be accepting its own demise. I don't know what the reason for that is. We struggled with this contradiction during the anti-MAI struggle. Why were our governments prepared to give up so much and get absolutely nothing in return? And the only answer I could think of is contained in a document that's 150 years old, and it says the state is the permanent committee for running the general affairs of the bourgeoisie. I'm sure that you will hear that. I expect I'll have to give you a reference on that. But we're at the point now where you can rent the government the way the American government was rented by Chiquita Brands and of course brought suit in the WTO. You don't have to do it directly. You don't have to have the investor-to-state dispute resolution the way it was outlined in the MAI. No, you can do it through governments. And our governments seem to be willing to give up their sovereignty and have great pleasure in doing so. Do we have allies in the UN system or in any place in the international system? Well, there again, the news is pretty bad. I have it on absolute authority, and I cannot tell you what my source is for obvious reasons. But last week, Mike Moore telephoned Mrs. Brundtland, who is the head of the World Health Organization, and he said, I've got enough on my plate as it is, and enough problems, and I don't want the World Health Organization raising any questions about genetically manipulated organisms or about AIDS medicines in South Africa or in Thailand. And Mrs. Brundtland accepted not to bring up any of these subjects. No, this is true. I'm very sorry to say it, but this is true. We've got several of the UN agencies that are now making alliances with these corporations. The UNDP has got its Global Sustainable Development Facility where no matter who you are, you can be the worst human rights violator, like Rio Tinto Zinc. If you pay $50,000, you can use the UN flag and the UN logo. And we've got Kofi Annan, who is helping to sponsor the Geneva Business Dialogue with the president of Nestle. We're calling him now, some of us who are not very respectful, we're calling him Nescofi. So, I want to quote our commissioner. We've got a new commission in Europe, and the trade commissioner is supposed to be a French socialist. I don't know how he got that label. He's replaced Sir Leon Britton, who was too conservative even for Margaret Thatcher. And Pascal Lamy says that, well, Britain's program was really a very, very good program. And this is what he says. He says in the Financial Times, the fallout from a breakdown, he's speaking about the negotiations here, the fallout from a breakdown could be serious. If some NGOs thought they had succeeded in destroying further liberalization, we'd be confronted with a real problem. So I want to invite you all to create a real problem for Pascal and me. He says something else. Not moving forward in economic matters doesn't make sense. Economics is a world where you always move forward. You never stop. Trade is based on the same sort of law. Well, maybe we should be moving forward, but certainly not on that road. We've got to stop and turn around, and we've got to do nothing less than overthrow the permanent government of the transnational corporations. This is difficult, and we shouldn't hide from ourselves the difficulty, because we've got to make a huge leap towards common action which transcends not just nationality, which is already hard enough, but we did a pretty good job of that during the MAI struggle. But we've also got to transcend all the other boundaries, all the boundaries of age, of class, of race, of gender, all special interests. Because we can win if we pledge ourselves to each other. Because history is handing us an enormous opportunity, and we've got to seize it. We are the actors who can create a real victory for international democracy, and we're going to start doing that tonight against the WTO.